Oh, hey there. I see you. You are curious about electric vehicles. I know it. That's why you're here. You're here to get the story about adventurers, specifically those down in Australia doing a whole lap around the country in an EV9, towing a camper behind them. That is the Electrekking family. Tim and Renee are coming onto the podcast today to talk about their journey. They're halfway through it, and it is really pretty impressive. I would love to go on an adventure like this, but I also really had such a fun time just hearing from them how they prepped, what they DIY'd with their setup, how they modified it, and what their perspective has been as this trip has come along. Why did they start it? How far have they gone? What did their kids think about it? What do other folks on the road think about it? Of course, Australia is a very different EV market compared to the US. They're at about 1% EV adoption for light duty. We're at around 8% in the US. And of course, there are other countries that are far, far beyond us. Like I said, they have an EV9 and a camper towed behind them that Tim fixed up to be more aerodynamic. He also rewired the system to be 48 volt from the 12-volt system. And it's generally really cool. I get to talk to them about all those things and more. So please tune in for today's episode that I hope you come away feeling inspired. You know a bit more about really what is capable with EVs. But I think a lot of us who do listen in understand that you can do a lot with electric that a lot of people think you can't. And as Renee points out as well, there's not necessarily compromises. There are new ways to do things, but they are still having the adventure that they want to have, and they actually don't feel like they have compromised their experience. They are mostly using solar charging or charging at campsites, so slow charging. They haven't had to use a lot of public fast DC infrastructure in Australia, which is a whole conversation of its own, which is another part that I love about this podcast is that they give us real insight into what it looks like on the ground in Australia when it comes to EV charging, EV regulation, and EV infrastructure and the general approach. I absolutely love speaking with them. At the end of the podcast, it turns out that their laptop got too hot and it shut off. But luckily, I just had one more question to ask them. And that was actually, I was going to just send them on their way and say, thank you so much for your time and energy because it was the morning for them and the evening for me. So they were just starting their day. Please make sure to catch them online at Electrekking. So ELECTREKKING.net. You can check out all the details on their solar camper, their setup, and everything. And maybe even a little bit more than we covered on the podcast, although this is a lovely long podcast speaking to this amazing couple about their trip, their lap around Australia, all electric. Pretty cool. All right, let's plug in for today's episode. Again, I'm your host, Francie. If I didn't say that, welcome back. Let's plug in. Let's get into it. I'm excited. Okay, everyone, I am so glad to welcome to the podcast Tim and Renee from Electrekking, calling in all the way from Australia. Thank you both so much for joining me today. You've hit, as you've just told me, 20,000 kilometers, and you got to keep it moving too. You're not even done. So welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
It's really exciting to see what you all call a demonstration journey for electric vehicles, where you really show, yeah, I can take my whole family and do a loop around Australia and charge our car and camp and get where we need to be and do it, like there's ups and downs, but really showing that electric vehicles are different, but they're not necessarily hugely limiting as a way to get around. So can you tell me a little bit more about this demonstration journey? How did this start? What is it too? Like if no one's heard of y'all, what are you doing?
So in Australia, we have a thing called long service leave, which I don't think is found in many other places in the world. And it started back when English settlers would come out to Australia, and it took months to get back home to England to have a holiday. So that people could go home, they introduced this special leave that after you'd worked somewhere for 10 years, you would be rewarded with 3 months paid leave. So at the moment, we're on long service leave that we've taken on half pay and a bit of extra. And so we've got 9 months to travel around the country. when Tim was a child, his family had this same opportunity, and they did a lap of Australia, and it was a really like a formative experience for his family, where they had all this time together to explore the country, to experience all of the beautiful nature, and just really connect with their country. And we wanted to be able to recreate that experience for our children while we're on this long service leave. But things have changed a fair bit since we were kids, and now there was the opportunity to consider doing it all electric. Australia's been pretty slow with the uptake of electric vehicles, and I guess that's been influenced in some ways by politics and by policies and by some of our leaders. So we had a Prime Minister several years back who made some really uninformed comments about EVs. So he made a famous statement that EVs would ruin the weekend, that they wouldn't be able to tow your boat, your camper, your caravan, or take you to your favourite camping spots, which we know isn't true, but many people in Australia, that's the message that they've received. So we thought doing our trip all electric would be a great opportunity to try and dispel some of those myths, show that EVs have come a long way, that it isn't as challenging as what people would think. So we've had quite a number of people who've already done full laps of Australia in their EVs, but towing our camper or caravan is obviously a whole new level. So it's been something that's we're really passionate about, and promoting more sustainable living, electrification of homes and transport. So this just really fitted in with our ethos. And we also like a good challenge. So that was part of the motivation as well. But it actually hasn't been as challenging as what people assume it was likely to be.
That's good to hear. I'm glad it hasn't been overly challenging. And it is such a shame sometimes how one statement or headline or whatever it is can stick in your mind. And then really what I think is like take away opportunities for exploring cool technology, like electric vehicles. I mean, it's really cool. And you took on the opportunity, kind of as you framed it, to show what can happen, but it didn't probably come out of nowhere. Were you driving electric before? Like, why electric vehicles? What got y'all into this originally?
I guess probably the fact that I'm an electronics engineer has helped that sort of background. So, fan of electronics and gadgets and gizmos and things. But we'd also electrified our house, and back in 2007, we started with our first Prius. Loved that. As soon as the plug-in hybrid was available, we switched to the 2015 Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrid, which really got us into the full electric when you're in electric mode. And so again, when the opportunity arose and we needed a new vehicle, we got a BYD E6, which is a bit of a unique electric taxi sort of vehicle a couple of years ago. That's a whole nother story on its own. And yeah, realized the advantages environmentally, financially, and maintenance and all those kind of things as well. So given that we'd electrified the home and this was going to be our home for the next 9 months traveling around, we thought, can we do the same trip fully electrified as well? A number of people said that it couldn't. A number of people said, yeah, you should be able to, but no one had actually done it. So we said, well, with a little bit of planning, yeah, why not? It is doable, we think. And until somebody does it, you've got all these naysayers who say it can't, but they haven't tried either. So that was the motivation behind that.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, you're kind of in the tech side of things, so you get an introduction. Because Australia also, your EV adoption rate is not that high, right? It's pretty low. Maybe like I saw this one by the Electric Vehicle Council, a report from earlier this year that was like 1% of the light duty vehicles on the road in Australia are electric. We're at maybe 8%. So, and then countries like Norway are like over 80, nearing 90%. And so it's so different. So obviously is that typically what you're seeing on the road around you? And I'll remind everyone, we haven't really mentioned it, but you are in a Kia EV9 and you are towing a solar powered camper. And also BYD. We don't really get those here, so that's cool. So we have similar but different experiences, I think.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
The offerings of vehicles in Australia are already quite limited. You guys have got quite a few more towing capable vehicles. We were jealously looking at all of those when we were doing our planning and going, come on, are these going to come over by the time we're ready to do our trip? But unfortunately, none of them, apart from the EV9, and the EV9 only just became available.
We got the first one in Western Australia, so that really facilitated us being able to do the trip all electric, because before these vehicles were available, it really would have just been the Tesla
Model Y or the
could have-
Volvo with a limited towing capacity compared to this one. So we would have had to have, changed what we did significantly as well. And that's one of the things we wanted to do in this. It wasn't so much a demonstration trip. We wanted to have a family holiday, and we wanted to prove that it was doable without too many concessions. It wasn't just had to be electric, and this is what we were about. We wanted to do a family holiday that was relatable to everyone else. So the more compromises we needed to do, the more people would be able to say, oh, that wasn't a proper trip, or etc., or not what we wanted to do. So we were quite glad when the EV9 became available, and it meant we could tow a reasonably large family camper without any real compromises.
But I think you mentioned that, the uptake's been low here in Australia, and I think that's largely because we just haven't had good leadership. The policies in Australia have been really quite appalling, and what it's meant is, we haven't had emission standards, and so Australia's just received all the vehicles that the rest of the world hasn't wanted, and there hasn't been that incentive for people to try out the new technology. I think more and more, and especially we've had some change in political leadership in recent years, and it's heading more in a direction where it's encouraging people to electrify, that people are wanting more options. And as Tim mentioned, things like BYDs, you're seeing a lot of them on the roads now, and I expect that uptake will see change quite significantly in the next couple of years as a result of those changes that have been implemented.
Plus, you would have had the same thing, the whole chicken and egg with chargers options versus the number of vehicles on the road. So there's been a few big projects in Australia, particularly in our home state, Western Australia, that's just made it a lot more easily because they've realised this need. And I guess just to give a bit of a context of the kind of challenge we had in the lead up to this, our home state, Western Australia, many of your listeners will probably realise that Australia is about the same size as the US, but our home state is one of the most isolated and largest areas in the world. I believe it's the second largest state outside of somewhere in Russia. It's to give a context, it's roughly the size of California and Texas and Alaska put together. It's about 2,000 kilometers from top to bottom, 1,500 kilometers from east to west. And our capital city, Perth, is really our only major city. It's the most isolated capital city apart from Hawaii, because it's 2,000 kilometers between us and the next town over 100,000 people. So we're talking big distances, a lot of sparsely populated areas. And a lot of remote outback that doesn't get a lot of support even with petrol, let alone with electricity as well. So,
and that's probably been one of the concerns Australians have had, because there is such vast distances and in a lot of areas limited populations. There hasn't been a lot of infrastructure, not just charging infrastructure in general. And while battery technology has been improving, people have still been concerned. They don't want to be stuck out in the middle of the outback with a flat battery. But as we know, the batteries have improved so much and are only going to continue to improve. So we're now at the stage where we've had major charging infrastructure go in. So pretty much the whole way around the country, especially in Western Australia, we've got charging infrastructure that's been put in about every 200 kilometres. So you can easily get around and be confident that there is something there for you to charge your vehicle. And so that fear and obviously that range anxiety that people have had is now not a factor that really needs to limit people's electric travel around Australia.
When we started this planning to make sure that we weren't going to end up stranded in the middle of nowhere as part of a demonstration, we'd worked out that about 280 kilometres, I guess that's roughly 200 miles, was the longest distance between charging stations, even in the outback. And they would often be slow charges, but at least an option. So when we planned for our towing kit and the sort of backup support that we'd be carrying with us, we were aiming at around that 280 kilometers. The Tesla Model Y and the Volvo wasn't quite going to get us there. So we had some plan B and C with battery options in the camper, etc. But yeah, with the Kia EV9, we've found that we're hitting that quite safely, and so it's been quite a comfortable trip.
I was also going to say, we also didn't want to spend 9 months just traveling around and visiting charging stations. That's not exactly an exciting trip for the family. So although there was the charges that we factored in, we didn't want to just stay on the main roads. That's not where all the good stuff is. You want to get off the main roads, explore the national parks, get to the areas where you can experience, untouched nature. So a lot of our planning also involved making sure that we could get to those places and enjoy them, because that's really the part of the trip that makes it worthwhile and meaningful.
Certainly. Oh, that's amazing. I love hearing your motivations behind what you're doing, and also how different and similar but different it is from what I've experienced in the US market. And so this is an interesting effort for the infrastructure. Like every 200 kilometers, basically hopefully there's a charger there, but also being able to go on those back roads, like you said, Renee, is so important, because that's part of the adventure as well. And EVs shouldn't be bound to the most highly populated areas, right? We should be able to go anywhere, just like if you're using petrol. One thing we kind of started to touch on it is, okay, the EV9 came, the Kia EV9, and that gave you the opportunity where you're going to be able to tow. So first off, an option came along, but also enough to tow like what you needed for your family, because it's you two and it's your two children, which is amazing to spend this much time together and this much time on the road. And later I want to ask about like what the young people tend to think, because I hang out with some young people, but I need to ask more young people what they like, young people, what they think about electric vehicles. But first, let's talk about the technical setup and specs that you have here. So you have an EV9. What's the trim of your EV9?
Yep. So in Australia, we've got the 3 trims: the Air, the Earth, and the GT line. I believe that we have the Earth model, which is in the middle. It's the all-wheel drive twin motor, 100 kilowatt hour battery. It's the equivalent of some of your land trims, I believe. Yeah, that's the lowest spec that we could get, the lowest cost with the towing capability, because the 2-wheel drive Air doesn't have the 2.5 ton tow rating that we sort of wanted. And we also weren't paying for the GT line with all the massage seats and the sunroof, which is a terrible idea in Australian outback, because you just have to cover it up, otherwise you'd cook.
True.
So yeah, as Renee said, we were lucky enough to get. It was actually a pre-production model, because it wasn't planned to be available in Australia before we wanted to leave, and we were lucky to get basically an early demo model that the dealer let us have, which was amazing. So that has given us a range of about 550 to 600 kilometers around the city. If you go out onto the highway, around 480 kilometers range. And once we put our 2-ton camper behind, drops at about 280 to 300 kilometers range.
Okay, great. Yeah. I mean, it's got the size for I've been in an EV9 myself, and I was like, oh, this is the best like family EV SUV that I've been in yet, simply because it's so airy. It seemed like ours had like the weather mats and everything. I was like, oh yeah, parents could just throw everything that they need in here, with kids, dogs, whatever they need, and have the room. Of course, you also have the solar camper on the back, so you wanted something that would be able to tow that. Can you tell me more about that? Like, what's a solar camper? What do you mean? Give me the details.
Sure. Okay, so what we ended up doing was finding we knew that the biggest range hit, my theory behind the biggest range hit of towing a vehicle is the aerodynamic loss of having a big, bulky basically sail or parachute behind the car. So the air that hits the back of a caravan or camper is going to drag you and slow you down and sap a lot of that range. The weight that you're towing is also important, particularly when you're accelerating. So if you're doing lots of start and stop, having an extra heavy weight behind you will actually use up a lot more energy. But once you're up to speed and cruising for long distances at a constant speed, one of the bigger influences that comes in is this aerodynamic drag behind the vehicle, which is why cars are always designed to be as sleek and as smooth as possible. And as soon as you hang a parachute behind it, it wrecks half of that. So we wanted to find a caravan or camper that was as streamlined as possible, and ideally the same height or lower than the height of the vehicle, which is tricky to get when you see the trend of caravans and things. They become these big, bulky mobile homes, and then you end up with massive cars in front of it to try and tow them. So we found the most suitable pop-top camper. It's the best way to describe it. It's like a caravan at the bottom half, but the roof electrically lifts up. There's a really cool electric Jack J system that this manufacturer has, that when you get to camp, you hit the button and the roof electrically lifts up, and it's canvas at the top half, and then 2 queen-size beds slide out the front and the back. So when you want to go in travel mode, the beds slide in, the roof comes back down, and it really packs a lot of living into a very small space behind the car. The height of the caravan towing is almost exactly the same height as the EV9, sorry. So as the airflow goes over the top of the camper, it's not actually hitting another surface of a caravan. It's smoothly going over the top of the camper. Over the top of the car to over the top of the camper. So that was important for us to find that kind of height for towing. And then there's a few other features that could do with some improvement. And the caravan industry is sort of getting on board, but they haven't quite got there yet. So the square back of a camper, and also of vehicles as well, and trucks is another big example, is as soon as you have a square backed vehicle, you have a lot of low pressure suction. So as the car moves through the air is a void left behind it, and a lot of turbulences behind it. That creates a lot of drag as well. The most ideal is if you can have a smooth, fastback equivalent of a car. And I thought, well, I've got room at the back of the camper to make it like that. So I ended up taking the back end off the caravan and modifying it. I put a very unique looking wedge boot on the back, kind of to mimic the trailing edge of the wing of an aircraft, because that's the most streamlined thing going through the air, is sort of like a very gentle curve at the front, and then a long tapered thin wing out the back. So I've actually added a boot or a trunk in your case in the back of the caravan to mimic that, and it helps getting the smooth air over the top to meet with the air coming underneath and join up again, and gets rid of that parasitic drag to improve the efficiency of the vehicles going through the air. And I'm pretty sure that's helped between about 10 to 15% overall. So that's 10 to 15% less
range loss.
Yeah, less range loss or less cost in electricity to recharge and keep going. And so that was the aerodynamics. And then when we've got the advantage of a bigger boot out the back, it means we've got a bigger roof space, so we can fit more solar panels on the roof. So we upgraded the solar from the original manufacturers of 340 watts, I think, to a combined, because I put the same solar panel on the roof of the EV9, which was otherwise wasted space, with 5 of the panels on the camper, to give us a total of 2,500 watts instead of 340. So that's a significant increase in collection of energy, which is all free and is happening whenever there's sun. So whether we're camped or we're
which is
traveling,
pretty much all the time.
yeah, exactly. In Australia, we've seen like 2 days of rain in the 4 months of traveling so far. So Australia's not short of collecting solar for free, so you might as well do it. And that provides us with all of our energy requirements for living in excess. So 1 day of sun collection will give us about 5 days of energy needed for camping. And with the 80% leftover we have at the end of the day, there's the opportunity of using that to top up the car, charge overnight, start again the next day with a flat battery, then the sun can top up while you're towing. By early afternoon, we've got another full battery ready to use and top up for the next night as well. So yeah, that's another good advantage. Plus, with the modified boot, we've actually got more space for putting in more junk, which is kind of counter to weight limits. But yeah, certainly all those options. And then, of course, to store all of that energy, the standard little battery that came with the original is certainly not sufficient. So that was replaced with lithium batteries. I put in 2 5 kilowatt hours to give us 10 kilowatt hours of batteries, and they're mounted underneath the camper to really help keep that low, stable center of gravity, which means that the trailer's very stable with towing. So yeah, a dream to take around. You don't even know it's on the back, and yeah, gives us that jerry can equivalent of extra energy. In case we ever need it, which fingers crossed we don't, but we haven't needed it so far, which has been a bonus. We thought we may have needed to rely on that a little more, but so far it's been a nice security, but yeah, hasn't been required.
I love hearing about these modifications. First off, making the boot, I mean, just and come to a peak like that is so cool and innovative. I mean, really, do you think that not solar campers in general, but I mean, should the EV outdoor market start making more of everything more teardrop, no matter what it is, where it goes to that bit? It seems like it does have a significant impact for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I can see why it hasn't happened, because it looks unique and different. It was quite a challenge getting it through all the Department of Transport re-inspections, because they went, whoa, we've never seen anything like this. And a lot of them initially thought there's no way this is going to pass all the standards, but it was designed to all the rules, and they went through all their checklists, and it passed.
It wasn't a challenge getting it through. It got through first time. It's just that it looked so different that people's initial impression is, hang on a sec, this is different.
It can't work. But yeah, no, it can. And yes, there is a bit of a trend with a few of the teardrop manufacturers making more streamlined. But unfortunately, I think a few of them have gone more for aesthetics rather than the actual dynamic principles. Some of them sort of taper off too much, or they're not quite the right shape. But then you've got the other counter of a boot space, which is maybe not the most ideally usable. It's sometimes a bit tricky to get things in and out, and it's a longer vehicle when people want shorter ones for maneuverability. So there's a bit of compromise there. But in our case, we've found maneuverability has been fine. We only put lightweight stuff that we can reach into the back of the camper, so that's fine. But yeah, I'm quite happy to take the 10-15% improvement on a day-to-day basis on a 9-month trip. It's significant.
It's been quite good as well, because it looks a bit unique. Whenever we arrive at a campsite, people notice it, which then opens up the opportunity for conversations, because people pay attention, and then they have a look and realize it's electric and the camper's electric. And for those who think, oh, EVs shouldn't be out here in the outback, they suddenly have had that notion challenged. And the amount of conversations that we're having with people while we're trying to set up camp, because they've just seen us pull in. But it's been a great way of triggering conversations and having that discussion with people who otherwise may not have even considered that using an EV for traveling was a possibility.
Do you see anyone with any kind of setup near yours along your route so far, or are you the most electric folks you've found?
Yeah, no, I've seen a few online, but we've yet to bump into anyone who isn't doing just a EV with a tent in the boot sort of trip. Yeah, we haven't seen anyone else towing anything as yet.
No, but we have had a number of people contact us who are planning on doing a trip, in the not too distant future, that are following us, and I guess helping them to have some confidence that their trip is also going to be manageable.
Yeah. Certainly. And you have the 2,500 watts of solar power capacity now. You have 10 kilowatt hour battery. I mean, that's a pretty good setup. So you changed that as well as one part of your modifications. But what about the wiring? You say that you also use that to charge your EV9. But did you have to do, I mean, it sounds like your background, Tim, outfits you for, the setup to be able to wire this however you need. But can you tell me more about that? What was that like?
Sure. I guess it definitely helps with my electrical background, but it's not that far out that you couldn't get somebody to get off-the-shelf components. There's a number of manufacturers now that are starting to realize the advantage of setups. So I changed the architecture from the 12-volt system to a 48-volt system. So the batteries are sitting at 48 volts, which just means that it's a little more efficient for collecting the higher voltage from the greater solar. And it's more efficient to invert it back from that DC 48 volts into we use 240 volts AC as standard over here, but the equivalent of your 110 AC. It's more efficient if you keep all the voltages high. It keeps the current lower. So I have an inverter, which is 3 kilowatt inverter to power all the AC side of things. And Victron is most of the components that I end up using. So Victron have a nice system which has a lot of data control and signaling between it all. There's a little screen which is quite a nice graphical touch screen to show you what level the battery's at, how much solar is coming in, and all the energy flow and needs of the camper. And that also is linked with an EVSE or electric vehicle supply equipment, which is basically an onboard charger. And that has a Type 2 plug that sits in the front of our van. So we've got a little frunk on the front of the van. And so we can easily plug a Type 2 to Type 2 cable from the car straight into the front of the van. And that provides us, it can provide up to 22 kilowatts of charging, but the EV9 will only accept 11 kilowatts of AC charging. But that, if we had enough battery capacity, is 10 hours of overnight. But otherwise, yeah, about 6 to 8 hours of charging off the van if we need it. So that sort of is the infrastructure to help there. And then we've got the ability to plug into shore power or mains if we want to at a caravan park, and that can either flow directly into the car or into the camper battery, and then the camper battery into the car. We've also got the advantage of switching it the other way if we go off-grid camping. So if for some reason, and we've only had it once when we believe our son may have been playing with the settings, flattened our camper battery without charging off the solar, found ourselves stuck at night in a shady spot going, oh, we've got no power. The advantage is all we do is plug in the vehicle to load adapter on the car, and then that provided a 15 amp 240 volt plug back into the camper, the equivalent of what a caravan park outlet would give us.
Oh, how cool. Okay, so you're getting not only load to you, but also vehicle to load, which is, I mean, you really sound like you have the setup to make it around the lap of Australia. Is there any modifications that after 20,000 kilometers, you're like, maybe we should have done that, or that you've tweaked along the way that maybe you should have started with, but how could you know? How could you know to start?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's a tricky one. I did end up with a bit of a major mishap. So the other thing I forgot to mention is that I also modified the front roof, the front of the roof of the camper with a big deflector that came down to try and catch more of that air over the top of the car, so it didn't drop into between the two vehicles. And I made that at an adjustable angle so that we weren't sure what car we were going to have initially. So if I needed to try and match a lower height vehicle, then that deflector could angle down and smoothly meet up with a lower height roof vehicle. The problem with that is that I then put the solar panels over the top of this deflector, which had a changing geometry, which meant that I couldn't secure the solar panels directly down to the roof, stick it with glue like the rest of them. And it was on a bit of a overly complicated sliding rail system, so that as the roof went up and down, the solar panels could then slide a little bit, and it worked really well for about 2,000 kilometers. And then the glue sticking to the rail for the solar panel started to lift, and suddenly within a few seconds that the wind peeled that solar panel off. It ended up disappearing over the back of the van and then got run over by a road train. So we lost one of the panels. And then as an emergency repair on the side, well, not quite the side of the road, we had to divert to a small country town. Ended up removing that whole system and using the one remaining panel that was coming over the top. I ended up luckily turning it 90 degrees and sticking it down to the roof before the hinge point, so that it's very much secure now. So I guess overcomplicating that factor just to try and get one extra panel on the roof meant that reliability on the road was a bit reduced. When you're going off-road, you want things to be as simple and reliable as possible. So that was one that if I did it again, I would have a smaller solar panel on the front deflector that didn't cross over the hinge point. But even with that sort of mishap, we found a country town that had a caravan repair person who was happy to lend me his workshop and fix that on the road. A couple of days and we're off again. So yeah, I guess these things are unforeseen, but still you can still manage and carry on. So that's one. But in terms of design, no, I think we've been pretty lucky. It's worked pretty well. I can't think of anything else that we would change. The only thing we would love to have improved on this trip so far is to have a little bit more ground clearance. The EV9 is still designed to be semi-off-road, is what they call it. There's been a few deep water crossings and some slightly more challenging terrain that the EV9 is not quite geared for off-road. But if we had the F-150 Lightning or the Cybertruck or the Silverado or anything like that, that's really the equivalent that we're working with that most people have for the serious off-roading stuff in Australia. And that would be the equivalent. So that's the only thing that's limited as, a tiny bit, but there's still a lot of the country to see that we've missed out on time, not on capabilities of the vehicle. So yeah, not too worried about that.
I was curious about your experience with the EV9 because your options are technically limited. The second you could get your hands on this, you took it. It's maybe not the best off-road vehicle, but I'd love to talk about it. You've driven it for many hours and along many different terrains. I know that you say you wish it had more clearance. What else would you take away from sitting in the EV9 for this long? What do you like about it? What do you think of like Kia's approach with this electric SUV?
Yeah, we've been very happy from comfort point of view. This is a lot more luxurious than any other vehicle we've ever had. It's definitely been a step up, but the room, the layout, the comfort, the features is more than comfortable. It's more than we're expecting for this kind of road trip. There's so much room. We've got a fridge in the back, which has got 12 volts, a 12 volt plug, as well as a 240 volt connector. We've got a lightweight set of drawers that we've put in the back. Australia camping culture has a tendency of putting the heavy duty four-wheel drive drawers in the back. So you've got sliding systems for lots of compartments. We had a look at those and the weights were all astronomical. It was 50 kilograms to put this drawer in before you even put the stuff in the drawer. Whereas Renee has very astutely found a lightweight plastic drawer scenario similar to what you'd have organization at home. And we've got 3 of them facing backwards next to the fridge when we open the boot, and then because of the 7 seats that we don't need, we've folded them down and put 9 of these big tray tub sort of things facing forwards. So if we need to get to any of that stuff that we need less frequently, then we just fold the kids' seats down and we've got a big array of drawers facing forwards. And that one, which has been a very handy storage system. It's got so much extra room. We've got the frunk, which you won't have with a ICE vehicle. So I've got all my charging cable options, my air compressor, the tire gauges and things, a little shovel, all those kind of things in the front for when we need things on the road. And yeah, the kids have got storage pocket things on the back of the driver and passenger seat, so they've got all their pens and pencils and electronic device when we let them have it, all of those kind of things sitting there in front of them to keep them occupied, so they're super happy. There are a few driver assist features that need a little bit of work. Kia have obviously had the requirements of a number of those things to get their 5-star safety rating through Australia, which they've explained to us need to be on by default, but we've had to turn a number of those features off whenever we've traveled. So one of those is the lane assist, to try and keep you in the right lane if you're drowsy and drift off. But the camera has detected in a lot of the country roads, has detected the white line in the center, but there's no white line on the outside of the road for us. And it's often detected the change in the patches in the bitumen and the asphalt to the gravel on the side of the road, and really plays havoc with adjustments that it shouldn't be doing because it's falsely detected the line, which is not fun when there's a camper on the back of it. So luckily there's a button on the steering wheel to turn it off, but that's something that we have to do every time we get in, and it's just become part of our routine of remembering to turn that off in the country roads. And we've got a few minor things where there wasn't a tow pack available for this car, and there still isn't in Australia for some reason. I've seen it available in the US, but they haven't given it to us here yet. So we had to get an aftermarket tow bar designed, measured up, and I fitted it myself because it was in a different state that it was manufactured. And that means that whenever we try and reverse with the camper, it doesn't know that there's a camper there, so it panics that there's a car behind us and slams on the brakes, and that's a setting that we have to keep turning off all the time as well. But I'm sure that will change once they come out with an official tow pack. But yeah, apart from that, the 100 kilowatt hour battery is really handy for that range, the long range. There isn't anything else in Australia that has a battery that large. So that's certainly helped with any range anxiety or issues, and capability makes this kind of trip possible. Oh yeah, that's true. We have been hit with that's been the only maintenance issue that I believe a number of the Kia EV9s have been hit with, and the EV6s, where the 12-volt battery, the starter accessory battery, ended up going flat a couple of times unexpectedly. It's meant to self-charge off the big pack, and it didn't do that a few times, and we found that we were stranded.
You weren't stranded.
Well, we got up in the morning and you can't get into the car without the manual process. That has since been replaced because it died a few times in a remote area. But yeah, hasn't given us any troubles since then. So hopefully. And we
carried a starter pack.
Yes, the jump pack meant that we were able to self-start the car. And my understanding of how to get into the car and jumper it myself was handy, even though Kia give us the roadside assist, which is available everywhere in Australia. It's just a long wait in some of the the more remote places to try and find someone to come out to us. So being self-sufficient there was kind of very handy.
Certainly, I think people don't think that the battery that will go flat is your 12 volt, but Kia does seem to have that issue. And you were talking about it a bit earlier, Renee, on like not only the communities that you're going between, but also like Australia there's a big mix of remote and populated areas. So I even with this rollout, I'd love to get like a better picture of someone who's never been to Australia, unfortunately, what your charging infrastructure is like, not only locations and typically how you find it, but also like who are the providers? What kind of charging speeds are you getting? Are they at petrol stations or are they at grocery stores? Are they in the middle of nowhere? Like what's your charging experience as EV drivers with a big old camper on the back?
So, yeah, I guess we need to have a different strategy when we're in the remote sections versus the more populated sections. So at the moment, we're on the east coast of Australia, heading from the top down to the bottom. And that, I suspect, would be a lot more similar to the populated coasts of the US, where we're not spoilt for choice, but there are a lot more charging options than in the remote sections. So you can actually choose to skip a bunch of charges, or it's, I guess, worthwhile doing little top-ups just in case one of the ones further down that you are relying on is out of station, out of action at the time. But the other thing we're finding is that in the more populated areas, we can't do the off-grid free camping options anyway. So you're required to go to a caravan park, and then you've got the option of paying for an unpowered site or a powered site. And here, the powered sites are only $10 a night more. And if you plug into the PowerPoint, you end up getting 30 to 40% charge with a trickle charge overnight. So that's quite cost effective for us. And a number of the caravan parks are now providing EV charging stations for free. If you turn up, you've got a Type 2 charger to charge overnight, which we can do a full charge overnight if as a bonus of paying for a caravan site. So often we find that we're leaving a campsite because, particularly if you stay 2 nights at a caravan park, even with day tripping in between, we've charged the car fully, and so we don't have to think about a recharge on the road until we're 250 kilometers down the road. And a lot of the times we're not traveling much more than that on this kind of trip anyway. So we're finding that we're using public charging options less and less because the caravan sites are actually providing us with the vast majority of that power anyway. So that's one bonus of not even having to think about that. Everybody else has to find a petrol station before leaving town, but we're already full because we've charged overnight, and off we go again. Yeah, the providers in the more populated city areas, there are a few petrol stations, service stations that are providing charge options. I would say less than 10-20% would actually have a charger as well. That is growing, but there's a slow uptake with that. The majority of the chargers are actually the government projects, I guess, to try and encourage tourism in certain areas. So they'll have fast chargers ranging from the 150 kilowatts in the bigger towns that have the local governments that can support that kind of infrastructure, to usually 50 kilowatt chargers in the more rural towns to help on major highway routes, I guess. And it varies from state to state. So each state, based on their appetite for assisting with EV rollouts and tourism, changes things a little. Our home state, Western Australia, is, like I said, one of the biggest and the most remote. We actually only have one power, one grid, and one supplier of electricity for the whole state. And so they've at least provided one government project, which is called the WA EV Highway, and I believe is now the longest single provider network. So that spans around the coast of our state, all the way from the South Australia border around up to the Northern Territory border, with a fast DC charger which varies from 50 to 150 kilowatts every 200 kilometers. That coastal highway covers the vast majority of where travelers go, because the inside of the state is so remote that very few people go there, and there's not a lot of tourist activities apart from being out in the bush in the middle of nowhere. And that drive, I guess, to put it in perspective, is I worked out the equivalent of driving from LA to New York via Seattle. So that's our coastal highway state route, which is long, and yeah, there's only one major city on that whole route, Perth, with 2 million people. Everywhere else are towns of 50 to 80,000 people would be the max you would see. So yeah, some big distances with what would be essentially small country towns dotted along the way. And so with those kind of more remote travel options, we would often free camp, because we love being out in nature, and so there's free camp options, or national park, very low facility type options, which obviously don't have electricity and don't have charging options, so the vast majority of them. But by having those fast chargers halfway in between, every 200 kilometers, we actually camp halfway in between. By the time we travel there, we've got half a charge. We can do little bits of top up of solar while we're there, if we're only there for a night or two. But then when we are ready to go again, we leave, get to that next fast charger around lunchtime. It's at a country town with an information, tourist information center, or a bakery where we get some lunch, toilet stop, and the kids want to play on the swing. Usually the car is charged, because we can get 80% charge in about 25 minutes. Usually the car's ready to go before the kids are ready to leave the playground. And we jump in the car, do a little sightseeing in the town, and then carry on to the next free camp, halfway to the next fast charger. So we had a lot of people saying, oh, you'll be spending all your time at sitting around at charging stations or at a petrol station in the middle of nowhere, sitting on a slow charge. But that hasn't been our experience at all. And I really believe with the supplementary of the caravan parks charging us overnight, I think we've spent less time at chargers not doing anything than we would have at petrol stations filling up where you can't do anything. So the advantage of charging at lunchtime is you plug it in and go off and do something fun, and you come back and it's charged. You don't have to sit there holding the pump for all that time. So
Interesting. So sounds like most of your charging has been the slower charging instead of the faster charging, which I think a lot of people would predict, like, oh, you're, like you said, you're going to need to stop at those chargers. But one, you have a cool setup, but also it seems like that is treated as an amenity at all of these outdoor sites, despite like the lower, uptake in EVs. But at those sites, they have, for your campers, that for your generators or whatever it is, they have electricity on site, which I think is really huge for, it sounds like, how you've been getting around. When you're charging when you charge in general, have you been charging up to 80%? Like how are you filling up? What do you typically do?
Yeah. If we're doing a bit of a longer stretch in the more populated areas, we'll fast charge to 80%, knowing that there'll be more options further ahead. And particularly if we know we're going to a caravan park, you can do that last 20-30% overnight very easily. So there's no point in spending extra time at a fast charger when you don't, not doing something as fun. Some of the more remote areas, we've definitely had to fast charge to 100% because we needed all of it. There was one section where we got caught out where there was a bit of a headwind, which I kind of accounted for, but didn't account for the elevation change that we ended up going uphill. We ended up rolling into town with 2% battery, which was quite stress-inducing for Renee in particular. I was, trying to hold the emotions back a bit, thinking, no, it's fine, we've got it. But that's the closest we've come to needing our plan B and C, which we've got as the backup in the camper as well.
They're really the only times when we've charged to 100, when we've known that the length of the next stretch is pushing the limits of the,
Yep.
the vehicle. But,
or we're at a place where slow charging gets us to 100%
Yeah.
already. So we've been charging slow charge to 100%, just because it saves that extra little bit of top up you might need in the middle of the day.
we also knew that if we were going to be rolling in somewhere right on the edge of our charging limit, that we could drop the camper a few kilometres back and do the last stretch without towing. And so in those situations where it was going to be a bit tight, we were keeping a very close eye on how we were going with our range, knowing that there were some options to get us where we needed to go if it did come to that. If the headwind was a lot stronger than we expected and things of that nature.
Yeah, and that's been a strategy that we've found other campers have done with their petrol and diesel cars. They've pushed the limits and they're not going to make the petrol station. You just drop the camper 20 k's back. Suddenly, without that drag, you can make that extra distance, get in, get a quick charge, come back, pick up the camper and go on again. So that's always plan B or C with sitting there on the side of the road, having a picnic and topping up from the camper. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, that is a good last resort. All right, let's just get rid of any extra weight we have if we have to stretch it, for whether you're driving combustion or electric. And speaking of the camper, what if when you do charge at these public sites, how difficult is it? Are there pull-through sites? I know that we talk about that a lot here, because as people do try to tow or want to tow with their electric vehicles, it can get hard to get into one of those spots in our parking lots with with a rig.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think with the remote chargers, the remote charging options, which are usually a roadhouse that has fuel.
Or sometimes around the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, or out of the middle of
literally in the middle of nowhere.
They've got a few to get that 200-kilometer points. They've had to put remote chargers, literally
solar panel array,
charger, battery,
and nothing else,
and often a diesel generator backup. Unfortunately, but they'll have them 150 kilometers from a town in either direction because there is just no roadhouse options out there. They at least have realized that they're not a destination point. They're a quick charge and go. So a lot of them have worked out that a pull-through bay is ideal for the car as well as anyone towing. But I think a lot of the chargers, particularly in the country towns where they want it near an information center, it's 50-50 whether they've thought of that or whether they've wanted to put the infrastructure in an area that's limited on space anyway. So there are places that we've had to disconnect the camper, but we haven't had any problems with finding an empty bay or often they've got double bays available for RV stops that we can disconnect there and leave it and then just drive a very short distance to the public charging options. But we've made sure our system's got the hammerlock hooks rather than the shackles, so that our connection disconnection's actually not that onerous. And that said, if you're going to a destination, you usually go to a caravan park and disconnect anyway, and you'll charge the next day during sightseeing or something like that. So if it's at an actual destination, city or where you're going to stay, the disconnections is not a problem because there's opportunities to charge when you're sightseeing that you don't have the van with you anyway. And in some of the more remote spots of WA, there's areas that aren't suitable for taking the van. You just want to go full driving in the vehicle on its own. So often you've had to disconnect the camper and go off separately to drive anyway. So if you're near a charger, then take that opportunity.
Yeah, if there's a will, there's a way. I'm sure you have a lot of systems in place that are allowing everything that you need to happen if it needs to happen. And I'm also thinking about your kids again. And I said I would come back to this because I am curious, like, what do they think about being on an electric road trip? And what do other kids like their age, if I feel like you probably hang out with more kids than I do. I don't have any kids, so I don't have any kids with kid friends. But like, what do they think about electric? What is their impression?
Oh, you can try.
I think that it seems to be there's a bit of yeah. I think there's a bit of hope that that generation, they're starting to realize that electric makes more sense. They're a bit more environmentally conscious. They're aware of, the need to be less polluting perhaps than future previous generations may have considered. So that conversation actually comes up. Whereas when I did my diesel trip around Australia when I was a kid, there wasn't a lot of options. So I guess it wasn't really talked about a lot. Whereas our kids have, when they've had a chance to play with other kids in the playground, the other kids have noticed that we've got an electric car and gone, oh, that's really cool. Wish we had an electric car, that kind of thing. So those conversations do pop up. And I think our kids occasionally have asked, they've had somebody, there was a great example where they were playing with kids and they said, oh, we've got an electric car at home. And they said, oh, why didn't you bring that one? And they said, oh, no, we had to buy a special diesel for this camper trip. And the parents sort of sidled up and the dad said to me, you've got me in a bit of a hard situation, because we were looking at doing this camper trip and we've got the electric car at home and we love it, but didn't think it was possible. And the kids are going, we should take the electric car. And we said, no, we can't do this kind of trip in an electric car. And then you guys rock up and make a fool out of me because they're now asking, you said we couldn't do it in an electric car. So, obviously there's, a bit of change happening, but I think, it's hopefully going to just become more and more prevalent and seen as an alternative option without it being anything particularly more difficult. And I think there's a lot of advantages that people are starting to realize that going all electric, we haven't had to have that same resource management that the others do, where they need to find somewhere to fill up their gas bottles and go and get where there's some people that are on multiple things where they've had to find gas for the caravan. This is liquid petroleum gas, sorry. And then they've had to go and find diesel for the diesel heater on the van, and then petrol for the car as well. So, that's just 3 resources that you got to manage, whereas,
I was going to say, back onto the kids, though.
Oh, yeah.
I think they really love it. Like, they like being a bit novel as well. That obviously makes them feel a bit special when, people want to come and talk to them and find out what they're doing. But they're so conscious of the environment, and, they'll make comments all the time about, they'll see black smoke coming from someone's exhaust or whatever. And, they'll just make comments themselves because, they've had so much more exposure to this than we did as kids, and just an awareness that, hey, this is a better option, and wanting to choose that. And, when they play spotter when we're driving on the highways, they're spotting EVs, like it's just become normal for them that EVs have so many advantages, and they want that and they like that. And, they're great little ambassadors themselves. It's fantastic.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. They sound like me when I hang out with my friends. I'm like, oh, there's an EV. There's an EV. They're like, hey, we get it. But that's really cool to hear. I do think that it's an interesting time. It's like they're being raised when their EVs are they just might be more prevalent in general. So maybe it's kind of like, oh, whatever, like EVs. But then the kids being excited about what their parents drive, and the fact that it could be electric or it could be diesel or it could be, just normal petrol, it's just an interesting thing to see. And I think I love the EVs for a lot of different reasons, not only because of the sustainability aspect, but it's really cool tech. They're quiet, they're fast, they're modern. There's a lot to like. So it is interesting to see that perspective, because of course one day they will be buying cars and voting and having their opinions on it. So I'm sure this will be, many, many, many memories I'm sure have been made on this trip, and you're only halfway through, right? So can you tell me what comes next for y'all? Looking ahead, what does halfway mean? What's your final destination? What comes next?
So we've started in Perth, as we said, which is the capital city of Western Australia. And we've gone all the way up the west coast, and there's amazing things to see there. There's, pristine coral reefs. We went swimming with the whale sharks. There's just beautiful gorges and canyons that we've got to explore. We went up through the Northern Territory, which is probably a lot of that is what people would imagine as outback Australia, lots of red dirt. And,
home of Crocodile Dundee.
Yeah, you know, yeah, be very careful around the all the waterways, and so, you know, real adventure kind of areas. And then we've spent the last couple of months in Queensland, which is really quite tropical, where the Great Barrier Reef is, beautiful rainforests. You know, we went horse riding on the beach where there's the Great Barrier Reef right there, and then there's the oldest rainforest in the world that you've come out of. It's magnificent.
Right past a 4-meter crocodile.
Yes, huge saltwater crocodile right on the beach as we were going past. We've been through some amazing paleontology sites where, you know, the kids just had a ball seeing all of the fossil finds and doing their own fossicking themselves.
Dinosaur trail, yeah,
like really so many incredible places. So now we're in Brisbane, which is the capital city of Queensland, and we're about to head down the coast, so through Sydney and Melbourne, the capital city Canberra, and then back along the Great Australian Bight and the Nullarbor eventually. So this part of Australia is probably the most populated where we are at the moment, but there's also really lovely national parks that we'll try and spend as much time in as possible, because there's just so much variation with, you know, being such a huge country. There's a lot of variety as you travel around the country. We're also going to go through the Red Centre, so through Uluru and some of the, you know, really iconic locations in the centre of Australia.
Yeah, the true outback sort of style.
Yeah. And then the trip back home to Western Australia involves us going across the Nullarbor, which is how long's the Nullarbor? It's the longest section of straight road, I think, in the world.
Yeah. And
the Nullarbor means no trees, so it's just, you know, very isolated.
From as far as you can see to the horizon, it's just sparse, couple of little scrub bushes, and the rest of it just sand for probably a good 1,500 kilometers. It's very, very remote. It'd have to be some of the most arid places in the world. And I think the longest straight section of road is something like 300 kilometers without any bend. So that'll be an interesting stretch as well from EV travel perspective, because some of the charging options along there are quite unique. So talk about the fish and chip oil. Yeah. So that was originally sort of it's really our main link from Western Australia across to the East Coast. Up through the north is even more remote. So we've actually done the trickier section from the EV perspective. But originally the only lifeline from Perth to the East Coast was across the Nullarbor. And so there are a few pioneers who decided to get the EVs across, we need to create these remote EV charging options. And a lot of those places didn't have any electricity at all. They were just roadhouses running off generators. And they decided, one, the capacity of these generators probably aren't enough to help EVs through. And two, we don't want to rely on them. So some industrial innovators decided to come up with a little more sustainable option as well. And they strategically placed at these roadhouses or usually a biodiesel generator. And so they have trucks coming through with the used fish and chip oil, like the fast food oils, come through and fill up tanks along the way, which is not uncommon in Australia for diesel drop-off points, where there'll be certain places where they just have regular trucks delivering diesel to a tank. So this fish and chip oil is being delivered along the way. And then these generators are burning the bio oil to produce the electricity for the EV charger. So that is actually helped bridge the gap across this Nullarbor section. But that said, by the time we get around, there's actually a couple of the motor vehicle associations of all the various states have got together and putting in their fast charging options. So there's been quite a rollout of solar panels and batteries with EV charging points, again, at these remote locations in the middle of nowhere, where there's no other infrastructure. So you've got to create it self-sustained from there. So.
How interesting the impact of EV travel, either directly or indirectly, like pushing tech or pushing different infrastructure in these places that otherwise maybe, who knows what would have taken it to get there. But also, yeah, if you still can't get it wired necessarily, get it hooked up to the grid, the fish and chips, that's great. I haven't heard of that. I remember growing up and hearing about cars that could run on that, but then at scale, like I never met anyone who was doing that or anything. But how cool. I love to hear that. So i- does that make you feel not so worried about this stretch that is kind of more remote? The infrastructure is a little bit more spotty in the middle of nowhere. Are you still confident based on the first half that you've done?
Yeah, like I said, I think it's helped that we've actually gone the trickier route, which is through the north of Australia. Yeah, there are a few more towns across the top, but they weren't necessarily geared up specifically for EV travel. Whereas the Nullarbor, someone's pre-thought of it, and there's been enough. That's the majority of trips to get from east to west in Australia. So that's a bit more proven, shall we say. And like I said, I was confident before we left, and on our trip, all these extra options are being installed as we're traveling around. So that's only going to make it easier.
Very
So
cool.
we've got about
If
4
there,
months left.
oh,
I
go
was
ahead,
just going
Renee.
to say, in terms of, we've got about 4 months left. So we've got, we can take our time to get across there, and that will be the very last bit. So yeah, feeling really confident about that now.
Yeah.
You say 4 months?
Yeah, so we're due back home around Christmas time.
Man, that's
I
a
know,
pretty
we're
good
lucky, aren't
setup.
we?
Yeah, I would love to be, if you need another kid, come along and tag along on your adventure. Um,
We've got 5 seats in the car.
there's room. There's room. I'll bring my own tent and
Yep.
I'll just
Yeah, you
camp
can fit
nearby.
3 adults in the back.
Perfect.
Sounds good.
I mean, I really do think this is such a cool example of not only like fun, do it yourself innovation with your rig, but also like dreaming this up, planning it. I know when we originally talked, you had spoken about like you can plan some things, but some things, you can't plan. So you have to also have an attitude that's like, okay, I got to be able to pivot and switch, but you're doing it and you're doing it in an EV9, you're doing it with solar power as well. And I know that I'm not the only one who wishes I were doing it as well. You're running into people who would like to, there's people on the internet that are doing it. But if you had to give folks advice who are listening, who are dreaming of an EV adventure of their own, whether it be this big and beautiful or smaller, what advice would you give them?
I think probably coming from a point of retrospective, looking back at it, that it's actually easier than we thought it was going to be. So I think the easiest way to get that experience and realize that it's actually not as tricky as it sounds is to do some smaller trips from home. So that maybe if you're worried about the range anxiety, just go to the point where you're comfortable, that you can get home. Go through all the camping day-to-day life stuff and realize what little bits you might need to add or whatever to make it happen, so that you're confident with the living arrangements and everything works from an energy management point of view there, without putting the two together. And yeah, do those short trips closer to home. And then once you're comfortable with that, then start pushing the boundaries with what you think is range anxiety. And suddenly you realize that you actually can reliably get there and further, and you get there and there are more options that you realize weren't an option until you get there. And I think some of that anxiety and concern goes away, and yeah, it just becomes easier and easier. Obviously, you've got to understand your setup, so don't buy something that someone else told you it can do this without you understanding it. But I think those trips closer to home will help you, get comfortable with that and understand it. And yeah, I think it's just a matter of you've got to experience it yourself to realize that the limitations or boundaries that you think are there are probably further away. You can do more, and there's more options out there.
That's good advice, I would say, and that's kind of what I tell people too. If they're going to go on an EV road trip, I'm like, just push it on the highway, to where you're comfortable and then go back home. But it's good to dip your toes in the water, but also to be familiar with your setup, with how whatever you're driving, whatever you're taking around, how that goes. Renee, do you have any advice that you would give?
I don't know about advice, but people kind of always think that you're going to have to make compromises, and that we haven't really had to compromise. Like, we've got a fantastic setup. It might not be as huge as some people's rigs are, but we have everything we need. Our camper everyone enjoys being in that space. And I think, that's shifting that mindset around about, sacrifice, and instead going, actually, what do we need? What do we want? Like, our kids love our camper. We all really enjoy being in that space, and we love the car. I think we're going to have a lot of trouble if we want to sell it when we get home, because the kids are quite attached to it. But not thinking about it being a lesser option, but actually being around the advantages that it has, because I don't think we would have been as happy with our setup and our car if we had done it in a more traditional way using fuel. So I guess it's really that shift in mindset and going, hey, actually, this is a really great option, as opposed to thinking in a negative way about it, because the reality is it's a brilliant way to travel.
I think that's a good point. I guess I didn't explain the setup inside the camper. We've got 2 induction cooktop plates for frying and things. We've got a microwave. We've got an electric hot water system. We've got a small air conditioner. We've got electric blankets on the bed, fans and things. All our electronic gizmos can charge, no problems whatsoever. So we've got more stuff than you need, particularly on a camping trip. We're not compromising with any of that. And we find that we've got more energy than we need, whereas other people are trying to conserve their gas and then have to change their route to try and pick up gas along the way, or a lot of the solar systems and things are set up as an afterthought rather than a primary. So they find that they can't camp in a shady spot, which is the ideal place to camp, because they need the sun, so they have to drag the camper out into the sun. And so I think when it's thought about as a primary, as Renee said, rather than as a compromise or a secondary, you get rid of a lot of those disadvantages and find that there's actually more advantages to going down this path.
Yeah, I love it. The growth mindset, embracing fun, cool new things is the way I think about it. But yeah, like a new experience and using the sun to power your family trip. I mean, it's very, very cool and very admirable. And if folks want to keep up with you, because you still have 4 months left, which is crazy, and I love that for you, how can they keep track of what you're doing? Are you updating? I know you have a website, but why don't you let them know how they could follow along if they wanted to?
Yeah, I guess the easiest quick point is electrekking.net. So electrekking.net is the website we've set up. I've got the initial blogs that we did before we left, but I've found that there's so much stuff on the road to do. I haven't had a chance to update a lot of that. A lot of that, I think, is going to be updated at the end of the trip to sort of show you the advantages and how things went and challenges and all those things you talked about, improvement suggestions and things like that post-trip. But Renee's been really good at updating people on the way with the little photos and videos.
Well, folks, of course, we lose our Australian friends that are in the outback. Just kidding. But I think we did have a connection issue at the end there. I was just about to say, hey, I've taken so much of your time. I'm sure you want to get back to your kids. So I do want to, of course, I will extend this to them directly, but thank Tim and Renee from Electrekking, their lap around Australia, so much for coming onto the podcast to tell us about their experience with the EV9, towing their solar camper with all of their modification. It was absolutely fascinating personally to hear about their journey, and I want to keep an eye on their continued adventures, but make sure to go out and check them out and support them, and keep a pulse on their journey, because I think a lot of us know that you can push the limits with electric vehicles, and as most importantly, as Renee was saying there's not that many compromises. So for everyone listening, be sure to check out the links in the description to follow this family's incredible electric trek around Australia, across Australia, up and down, side to side Australia. And as always, stay tuned for everything out of spec. We're always covering everything electric. Drive safely, stay charged, and thank you for listening. Bye, y'all.